Hello, Year 11. So today we are going to revise the Cratchits and their presentation in Stave 4 compared to when we see them in the present in Stave 3. We're also going to read the very last section of Stave 4 and look at the change that we see in Scrooge from Stave 1. First of all, as always, we're going to revise some key vocabulary. So last lesson we looked at a shroud. Why do you think Dickens decided to have the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come wear a shroud? Why be shrouded? What do you think Dickens' intentions are there? Our new word today is recollect. Now, to recollect is to remember something or possibly someone. So you can pause the video quickly and write that down. So how do old Joe and Mrs. Dilber and the laundress and the undertaker's assistant, how do they recollect Scrooge? So you can pause the video and answer those questions. So a shroud can have two meanings. A shroud can be a cloth used to cover a dead body. Equally, describing someone or something as being shrouded would be covered and obscured, so you can't see them properly. Now, we're told that the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is shrouded in a deep black garment, this almost cloak that makes his face and all of his features and his body all unrecognisable apart from one sort of skeletal hand. But we equally have the other meaning of the word shroud, meaning death, essentially linked to a dead body. Now, we know that Stave 4 is a glimpse into a Christmas in the future. And we know that Dickens has deliberately made the future look bleak and dark and full of death. We also know that Dickens did this deliberately straight after ignorance and want. In the extract with ignorance and want at the end of Stave 3, Dickens tells us very explicitly that if mankind does not shed itself of its two worst sins, ignorance and avarice, or greed or want, then they will doom themselves. Then suddenly this shrouded Grim Reaper ghost that symbolises death appears at the end of that stave. And everything that we see in Stave 4 has been tainted by this doom and darkness, excuse me, and death. And that is deliberate because Dickens is almost giving the reader a glimpse into this dark future that will happen if they do not change. And remember, everything in this book, every single word on this page has the single purpose of getting the rich to change their views towards the poor. And if you remember that in your essays and you constantly refer back to it, then you will do well. So recollect then, to remember. Old Joe and Mrs. Dilber recollect Scrooge very negatively, as does everybody in Stave 4. They say that it isn't a sin to steal Scrooge's stuff because if he had been a nicer, more philanthropic, benevolent, generous, jovial man in his life, then people would respect him in death. So actually, it sort of serves him right and they don't care. Now, this is really important because, again, throughout Stave 4, Dickens is giving us the message that if you live your life full of sin, pushing people away, focusing on only yourself and your own greed, then ultimately, not only when you die, you are going to be punished through purgatory or hell, which we see through Jacob Marley and the other ghosts that join him at the end of Stave 1. No one will warn you when you die. No one will respect and give tribute to your dead body. All of your worldly goods, all of your wealth, all of your material, useless, meaningless possessions will mean nothing because you haven't gifted it to anybody. Like Fred says in Stave 4, there's no point having money if you don't do good with it. So again, Old Joe and Mrs. Dilber, it's a seemingly random moment really of Stave 4, these sort of horrible old, almost caricature old people who are really nasty and criminal. They're really important, as is every little random character in this book, because they're each teaching Scrooge and the reader a moral message. And Old Joe and Mrs. Dilber are teaching Scrooge and the reader that you reap what you sow in death if you do not be a decent person in life. And that's why they recollect him so negatively. So today we're going to focus predominantly on the Cratchit family. Now we see Bob, his wife, Tiny Tim, and all of his other children in Stave 3 in the Christmas present, very happy, very supportive, very wonderful, very good, decent, moral Christian folk. We know the purpose of the Cratchit family is to teach Scrooge and the reader to be less ignorant, because the poor are not bad people. The poor are not idle. The poor do not deserve the way they are treated. Because how could anybody look at this holy, pure, innocent figure of Tiny Tim and think, oh, well, yeah, who cares if you die? And that is the very important significance of the Cratchit family. And again, they view Christmas as a time of family, not as a time to be bitter and resentful at everything that you don't have, because what they do have is so much more important than wealth. However, in Stave 4, as we'll see today, the Cratchit family are revisited, and tragedy has struck them, just as the Ghost of Christmas Present said it would. Tiny Tim will not see another Christmas if no one intervenes, and in this future is a future where Scrooge is unchanged. And we see, as a direct result of that, Tiny Tim's death. We're going to look at why Dickens has bothered to revisit the Cratchit family. What message does their attitude to Tiny Tim's death give us? So we are going to switch over to the visualizer now, and we are going to read the section with the Cratchit family. It always makes me feel very sad, this bit. So hopefully you should see the visualizer now. So we've just read the end with Old Joe and Mrs. Dilber. What we see, and again, I'm not rereading the whole book to you because we'd be here forever. If you haven't reread the entirety of A Christmas Carol this academic year, I would advise you to maybe sit down and read the whole thing over half term, because you are going to be doing an essay when you get back after half term. Whilst we've revised and gone over the key important bits, we don't have time to reread the whole thing together. So I'm going to skip over this bit here. Basically, the ghost takes Scrooge to his bedroom. Scrooge doesn't realise it's his bedroom because it's really, really dark, and he sees this body alone on the bed with the curtains ripped down, and there's a sort of sheet over the body. And it's really sad and sort of tragic, because there's no one there crying over the body, no one there tending to him, as would have been the sort of normal practice then. And the ghost tries to get Scrooge to peel back the sheet, essentially, and see the body, and Scrooge is too afraid to do it. So Scrooge turns around to the ghost and basically says, show me if there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized. Show that person to me, spirit, I beseech, I beg you. So Scrooge doesn't realize that this man is him yet. We pretty much have worked it out. So Scrooge says, show me someone who feels an emotion about this man's death. And the ghost then shows him this poor woman and her children waiting for her husband to return. Now, we're not going to read this bit, although I would recommend you do it for revision. It's a woman called Caroline and her husband, and they owe Scrooge money. And basically she says, we are quite ruined. And he says, no, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. So they owe him money that they're unable to pay back. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. So this woman's first emotion was happiness that Scrooge is dead. So Scrooge asked the ghost, show me someone that feels an emotion linked to this man's death, and she feels happy. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. So she then realizes that's a sin, it's very unchristian, and prays for forgiveness for her sins to God, but she couldn't help her initial gut reaction. So basically they just discuss that even if their debt's transferred to somebody else, no one could be as heartless and sort of awful as Scrooge. And Scrooge, frustrated, says, "Let me see some tenderness connected with a death," said Scrooge, "or that dark chamber spirit which we just left just now will be forever present to me." So he said, let me show some tenderness, some grief. And we go then to the Cratchits. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. So Dickens has reminded us that we've been there before. Quiet. Sorry, I'm always elbowing this visualizer. So look at the contrast to to Stave 3. They were running around. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. So a completely different mood and atmosphere. And he took the child and set him in the midst of them. So Peter is essentially reading them the Bible. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," she said. "The colour? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." So we realise that actually what she's doing is she has tears in her eyes, but is making an excuse because she doesn't want to upset her children. She's trying to be strong for them. "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time." So she's trying to again be strong for her husband as well. "Past it rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, mother." Now remember, in Stave 3, Bob came running in with Tiny Tim on his shoulder. They'd come from church. So this Christmas, it's very different. They were very quiet again. At last she said in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed." "And so have I," cried Peter, "often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. So had all. "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work, "and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there is your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob, he's always described as little, in his comforter, that's that scarf, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." So these two younger Cratchits, even they're trying to comfort their dad and sort of give him a hug. Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. So again, they're good Christian people. They're trying to accept and realize that Tiny Tim is with God, Tiny Tim is in heaven, and as difficult as their grief is, they know that they should have faith that Tiny Tim is in a better place, and for the sake of each other, try and put a brave face on. So again, whilst obviously if you're a Christian you mourn it when someone dies, the idea is that you should also celebrate the fact that that loved one is now returned to God, which is of course a fundamental belief if you are Christian in this concept of the afterlife. So they're all trying to be brave. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. So Sunday is when it's going to be Tiny Tim's funeral, and what they're stitching is obviously something possibly to bury him in. "Sunday, you went today then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. So he's gone to sort out Tiny Tim's grave. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised it that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little, little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been further apart perhaps than they were. So he breaks down in tears. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. So upstairs, remember, they've only got 4 rooms in their entire house. They have put all of their Christmas decorations in this one room. And in this room lays the body of Tiny Tim. Particularly if you were poor, it would have been normal practice for the dead body of a loved one to be left in your house for a certain period of time, and it would be typical for the family to visit that body and to mourn. It's not really the same nowadays. It's sort of whisked off to the sort of hospital, but it would have been usual for them to keep Tiny Tim's body. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face and was reconciled to what had happened and went down again quite happy. I always find myself really moved by this bit, no matter how many years and times I've taught this book. This image of this little room lit by candlelight with this poor little boy who has died and was so beloved by his family. The fact that they've taken the time to decorate it with Christmas decorations, it's that, I think, that really gets me emotionally. Obviously, being a mother, anything to do with children dying is something that I find really emotional and hard to deal with anyway, because I can't imagine the pain of somebody experiencing that. To me, it's every parent's absolute worst nightmare. And I do find this really, really powerful and really emotional for those reasons. And Dickens intends for it to be powerful and emotional. You know, they loved this boy dearly, and they're continuing to pay tribute to him when he has died. A complete juxtaposition, of course, to Scrooge's abandoned dead body with the shirt stolen off his back and the bed curtains torn down, alone with only rats for company that will probably gnaw on his dead body, because there's no one there to do the same for Scrooge. So the contrast between Scrooge's death that no one cares about and Tiny Tim's death, who never should have died anyway, but is so beloved and so mourned and grieved for by his family, again, is very deliberate. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew. Now, this is really important because we don't see Fred, but we hear about him, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, so Fred noticed Bob looked sad, inquired what had happened to distress him, on which said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you had ever heard. I told him, I am heartily sorry for it, Mrs. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, however, did he said how he ever knew that, I didn't know. So Bob's having a little joke here. Knew what, my dear? Why, that you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everybody knows that, said Peter. Very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. I hope they do. So again, it's showing that even in the wake of their grief, they can carry on for the sake of each other. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. So Fred shows benevolence and philanthropy, generosity and kindness and charity. He not only is deeply sorry for Bob's loss, he gives him his card, and which has his address on, and says, please, if there's anything I can ever do for you or your family, come to me and I'll help you. And it's that is what Dickens wants people to do. It's not about giving loads of money. If you are in a position to help somebody, to show somebody some kindness, do it. That is all Dickens, and in fact Priestley in An Inspector Calls is wanting us to understand. Now, it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way that this was quite delightful. It seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. It's the empathy Fred shows. So it's, as Bob says here, it's not that he could do anything for us, it's the kindness. He truly took a moment to empathise with their grief. "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be sure of it, my dear," returned Bob, "if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't at all be surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. So he thinks maybe Fred might help Peter, the eldest male child, get a decent job." "Only hear that, only hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob, "one of these days. So there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure that none of us shall forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us." "Never, father," cried they all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." So they are vowing that in Tiny Tim's memory, they're not going to argue amongst themselves. They're going to carry on living in a good, moral, pure Christian way, just like Tiny Tim would have wanted. "No, never, father," they all cried again. "I am very happy," said little Bob. "I am very happy." So again, even in the wake of this great grief, Bob has a decent moral attitude to it all, rather than be sort of just filled with bitterness and anger. He's vowing to lead a good life in Tiny Tim's memory. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. "Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." "Spectre," said Scrooge, "something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead." We're not going to read all of this, but he goes to a graveyard, essentially. "A churchyard here, then. The wretched man, whose name he had now to learn, lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, a worthy place." So he's being sarcastic there. Because no one cares about Scrooge's funeral, he's just buried in some horrible place, basically. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. So Scrooge is beginning to work out what name he's going to see. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadow of the things that may be only?" So Scrooge is going, can I change this? Is this what will be, or is it only what might be? Still the ghost pointed downwards to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it thus with what you show me." So again, he's saying, can I change? Can I change this future? The spirit was immovable as ever. Now, this is so important. Scrooge gets no promises from the spirit that he can change this future. And that's really important to realise going into Stave 5, which, as we know, Scrooge does change. And a lot of people say, oh, well, Scrooge only changes because he doesn't want to go to purgatory. And yes, that is probably part of it. But he has no guarantees that by changing, he will be able to go to heaven. But he does it anyway. And it's that that's really important to realise. He doesn't know that it's not too late, but he has faith that it's not too late. And as Christians would know, the Bible teaches that essentially if you have faith in God and are truly repentant, then you will go to heaven. But Scrooge gets no promises here. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I the man who lay upon the bed? He cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. No, spirit. Oh, no, no, no. The finger was still there. Spirit, he cried, tight clutching at his robe. Hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope? For the first time the hand appeared to shake. Good spirit, he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it. So he's on his knees. Your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. So if I change, can I change the future? The kind hand trembled. I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. So I will behave in the spirit of Christmas every day of the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Now, by spirits, he's not just referring to the three ghosts, but again, the Christian Holy Trinity of God the Son, Jesus, God the Father, and then God the Holy Spirit. So again, I will live by the true Christian ideals my whole life. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone. In his agony, he caught the spectral hand, and it sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hand in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. And that's when we get to Stave 5, which is, of course, when Scrooge wakes up in his bedroom, that we will look at in the live lesson tomorrow. So the last thing I'd like you to do, I'm just getting the PowerPoint back up, should appear momentarily, is to answer a few questions about the Cratchits, and then a few questions about the significance of that slide. Sorry, of the end of Stave 4. So how does Dickens show a contrast to the behaviour of the Cratchit family in Stave 3? So how are they different in Stave 4? How do the Cratchit family behave towards each other in their grief? What do they vow to do in Tiny Tim's memory? And also, what do you think is the purpose of this extract? So I'd like you to pause the video now, please, and answer those questions before moving on to the final slide. So finally, we've read to the end of Stave 4. How is Scrooge presented at the end of Stave 4? And how does this contrast to his presentation in Stave 1? Think about the change that we see here. Okay, so if you can make sure, please, that when you answer these questions, you submit your work to your class teacher, either a photograph or the document that you've typed on. It's really important that you do that so we can see that you are understanding these lessons. So Tuesday and Wednesday you will have live lessons. Thursday there will be a final quiz on the whole of the novel, because we will have finished it on Wednesday. Then after half term you are going to be doing a practice exam question on A Christmas Carol. Okay, so I will see you tomorrow.